Okay, this is Natives of Alaska, the Yupik PowerPoint that's continued, and this is part 3. So, at the time of contact, the Yupik Eskimos were an anomaly. There wasn't a lot of interest in the region by the Russians, and the first reports started coming in around the 1760s, but the fur wasn't that great there. They had beaver, but not the mammals that the Aleutians had. And right around the time of Russian penetration, meaning when the Russians became more serious about the Yukon-Kuskokwim area, we had what was called the War of the Eye. And this was around 1816. This is documented, so it's not legend or story. And just so you know, and I don't speak Yupik, but Kaziak is the name of the communal men's house. And so what we're going to talk about here in a few minutes is that in the Yupik region, all of the men, including the old men and boys from about 10 years of age up, lived in the men's house where they ate, worked, and slept. So they lived separately from the women. So what was going on is one day in one of these communal men's houses on the Yukon-Kuskokwim, boys were playing darts. Boys will be boys. And so one kid threw a dart and missed his target and instead ended up having the dart go into the eye of another youth. Well, the father of the boy who got the dart in his eye then went up to the initiator of this whole thing and took a dart and cut his eye out with the dart. And then that second kid's father, then it turned into this whole big feud, which eventually, because there were different kin groups in these men's houses, spread throughout the Yukon-Kuskokwim area, and basically men were going around poking each other's eyes out as well as killing each other. So this was called the War of the Eye. And imagine if you're a Russian soldier going into Yupik territory and there's all these people not only at war but with their eyes poked out. And so the Russians kind of backed off initially because all this stuff was going on. So at the time of contact, which was right around that time period when the Russians became more interested because of the beaver trade, we know the most about the Yukon-Kuskokwim regions. So basically, in terms of physical characteristics, looked a lot like the Aleuts, where there was a lot of tattooing. They had librettes. Clothing was similar. And we also know that they had kayaks. And as I said in the section with the Aleuts, that it's disputed who had kayaks first, because at the oldest sites in the Yukon-Kuskokwim area, which it's harder to do archaeology there, there's evidence of adaptation to a maritime environment as well, so they had kayaks very early on. So the Kaziak, also known as the Kashim, was where the men ate, slept, worked. And so these were dwellings. All the dwellings in this region were semi-subterranean. So here is kind of an example of one. And so you can see the original Arctic entryways were underground because it trapped in the heat. And so you would actually crawl through this tunnel to get to the main part of the structure. So in the book Eskimo Essays, you're going to read about the real people and the Children of Thunder, which is about the Kilbucks, who were Moravian missionaries. So a lot of what we know about what life was like during this time, which was around the 1880s, comes from them. We also know a little from the Russians who came earlier on. So this is from Edith Kilbuck, who had diaries, and she wrote a lot of letters. And so Anne Riordan, again, the author of your book Eskimo Essays, also did a whole book called The Real People and the Children of Thunder, which was about the Killbuck missionaries. So Edith wrote, and this is right from her writings, every male in the village has a place in the Kashim. In custom places the aged directly over the entrance, a tacit evidence of being ready to go out for good. The next in age occupy places on the right and left of the oldest, and so on. The side of the Kashim over the entrance is for the old men, and the side opposite for the young men, and the two remaining sides are occupied by the middle-aged, while on the floor are the boys. The first rule governing life in the Kashim is respect for the place. Loud conversation, boisterousness, quarreling, and scuffling are all tabooed. The old men are recognized as the mentors or the monitors. And so they're the ones that give a talk early in the morning. Now, what you have to remember is that in this area, if you've ever heard the joke about the Bethel National Forest, it's because there isn't a lot of wood in this area either. So how did they have wood to make sweat baths, which they had in the Kashims? So again, Edith is writing that the Eskimos practice the adage, early to bed and early to rise. So usually 7 or 8 o'clock is the usual bedtime, and 3 o'clock in the morning the men are astir. The wood is split up with an ivory walrus tusk fastened by thongs to a handle. The wood is voluntarily contributed by the men. When a man has a piece of work to bring in or take out, which necessitates the opening of the window, he furnishes the fuel necessary for reheating the Kashim. One of the fines sometimes imposed for reheating is to require wood from the offender, and still another method of getting fuel for the Kashim, particularly after a protracted storm in winter, is through pulling. The men pull each other off the bench, and those pulled are honor bound to bring in more wood. Okay, and then the part that you do need to know is the women would actually bring the men their food. So understand, now you have all the men in the village sitting in this Kashim. A lot of times they were naked because they were sweat bathing right in the same room. And so it was the daughters and the wives who would bring them their food. So a lot of times the daughters would just bring the food to their fathers and brothers, and she'd sit on the floor amongst all these naked men, and then they'd eventually give her the bowl back, and then they'd go back into their homes. So what you do need to know is that, how can I say this? Men were usually strangers in the house where the women lived. So a typical household, aside from the Kashim, included an old woman, her daughter or daughters, and their daughters, plus boys under about 9 years of age. So the work routine was supervised by the old woman. And then, the boys were kind of aloof because they were waiting for their turn to go to the Kashim. So Wendell Oswald, who wrote a book called Bashful No Longer, wrote, young boys respected their grandmothers but remained aloof from them. Their loyalties were reserved for male relative in the man's house. This living arrangement did not foster close conjugal bonds. A man always was something of an outsider in the house where his wife lived, although he might stay there overnight or when he was ill. Women and girls visited a Kashim to attend ceremonies, but never remained there overnight. So this was the living situation of the Yupik Eskimos. And so here's a picture, it's not the best picture, but of what they look like from the outside. So again, it just looked like an earth mound because the majority of the structure was underground for warmth. Shamans were thought to have supernatural powers, and again, this area, the Yupik area, is most known for their masks. Their masks are world famous, and that's why you're going to be watching the film Eyes of the Spirit. And as you'll see from the film, these were given away after performances or used as toys. So the last thing that you're going to read about is the Yupik version of the boogeyman or the hairy man. Every Alaskan native culture has some version of this. And then also there's the Icinerac or the Eskimo leprechauns. And again, I will give you some readings on them because they are well known in the Arctic. Supposedly a lot of people have seen them. So that's it for now.